Hey everyone, this is lecture 14 for POS 273, International Relations, an online undergraduate course taught in the Political Science Department in the University of Maine, and I'm the instructor Rob Glover. So today we're going to delve into human psychology and the human brain and the way that it works and some of the insights that can be pulled from psychology to understand international relations and in particular the way that decision-making happens in international relations. So we're drawing upon some insights from cognitive psychology. So the first thing we'll look at is how can insights from cognitive psychology enrich our understanding of IR? What I want to go into is the ways in which cognitive psychology, as this emerging field, understanding the way that the brain interprets information, processes that information, and then makes decisions, how that really is a different understanding of human psychology than the one that we get from international relations, and it's arguably a better one. It gives us a more realistic picture of the way that the brain actually works, and then we can have a richer understanding of international relations as a result. We'll talk about some of the fundamental attributes of human cognitive psychology that are useful in thinking about IR decision-making. So there are some things now that, because of advances in cognitive psychology, we know pretty confidently that this is the way that the brain operates. This is the way that nearly all humans behave, right? And so we can make assumptions and understand the way that decision-making happens in international relations as a result. And as we go along, we'll be talking about cases or examples that can be interpreted through this lens. So are there specific examples of things that happened historically or more recently in international relations, and how do they exemplify and help us understand some of these different insights? So that's what we're going to cover today. Cognitive psychology. So when we're talking about cognitive psychology, we're talking about human cognition, the way that individuals sense and perceive the world, the way that they take in information, and then the way that they try to process it and engage in action on the basis of it. And it's a very different understanding than the way that we typically talk about individual decision-making in international relations, or arguably in lots of other fields, right? So like economics operates with this understanding of individuals as dispassionate, rational utility maximizers. And a lot of other social sciences, political science, and international relations included, for the purposes of making predictions and trying to understand the world, will basically kind of assume that, right? The individuals are rational. They make decisions on the basis of rationality as opposed to, passion or emotion or just randomness, and that they will try to maximize utility. So they'll try to maximize kind of the good outcomes for themselves and minimize the bad outcomes. In IR, we call this the individual level of analysis, or in some IR writings, you hear first image analysis. That's the language that Dresner uses in his book. And we're really getting down to the level of the individual. So we're not talking about the system anymore. We're not talking about domestic characteristics of politics and how they shape IR. And we're not even talking about small groups. So last time we were talking about bureaucratic representatives and these small group decision-making settings. Here we're really delving right into the individual. This could be an individual leader. It could be a head of state trying to process information and make decisions. And cognitive psychology has been very helpful there because some of those assumptions that we have about dispassionate rationality and the idea that we're just kind of these robots that set out to maximize utility, they're not really accurate, right? When we look at cognitive psychology, when you actually look at images of how the brain works, what you find is that this whole distinction between reason and emotion, or rationality and non-rationality, that's not really the way that the brain operates. That's something that we carried over from a period in which we didn't understand how the brain worked, right? It was this very abstract. It was philosophers who were trying to tell us about distinctions between heart and mind and soul and body and things like that. And when we look at the brain, it's really the idea that reason and emotion, or what we call reason and emotion, are bound up with one another. This whole distinction between reason and emotion has been really a fiction. That's not the way that the brain operates. it's almost impossible for humans to behave according to some sort of pure rationality. There have been individuals in history who the portion of their brain that that does like emotional responses and things like that has not been as developed as the rational part of the brain, either because of some sort of brain disorder or because of traumatic injury. And usually it's the latter, right? So if somebody suffers a traumatic brain injury, they might operate according to a purely rational framework. And what we've learned from studying those individuals is that they have a very hard time functioning in human society, right? They have a very hard time making decisions. They have a very hard time planning for the future. And what cognitive psychology at this point thinks is that the reason why that is because what we interpret as normal human behavior is in fact this intricate blend of emotion and rationality. So some of these notions of like dispassionate, rational, utility maximizer, they don't really exist, or if they do exist, it's because their brain is deeply disordered, right? Their brain is traumatically damaged in some way. And so what we now know is that emotional responses, things like fear and disgust, are really bound up with how we know and understand the world. And even when we think we're behaving in, kind of a calm, sober, rational framework, in the background there's some sort of emotional response operating there. So Dresner, in his book, he mentions things like, our response to the AIDS crisis, right? And you look back and look at the way that we initially handled the outbreak of AIDS in the 1980s, and it was not purely rational. It was bound up with all sorts of elements of emotion and fear and disgust. He also talks about epidemics, invasions, attacks. Any way that you respond to that, even if you think you're behaving rationally, is going to have elements of emotion bound up in it. A couple concrete examples I can give you. So one of the foreign policy moves that Donald Trump engaged in relatively early in his administration was an airstrike on Syria. And that wasn't really expected, right? So Syria had used chemical weapons on its population, and the Syrian government had utilized chemical weapons. And they had done this before, and it's pretty verifiably true. Like, we pretty much know that they have done this, that they have used chemical weapons against their population. And it wasn't really expected that Trump was going to do anything, because the foreign policy signals that he was giving on the campaign trail and early in his presidency, it was basically that he didn't want to get tangled up in these intractable foreign conflicts, right? He didn't want to get mixed up in things like Iraq. He was very critical of the decision to go to Iraq and this protracted conflict that we had there. And then, to everyone's surprise, he launched airstrikes, or I think they might have actually been Tomahawk missiles launched from a ship, but there was a bombing of strategic Syrian government sites, specifically an airstrip that had been used to drop these bombs. And everyone was kind of surprised, and there was this moment in which we were saying, what changed? Why did Trump decide that this was something that he wanted to use force? And we don't know how reliable these accounts are, but a lot of different people said that basically it was that he saw images of the children that were affected by this chemical weapons attack against, civilians, women, children, ordinary people going about their day, and was so struck by the fact that there were these children suffering, and many of them died, and died in a horrifically cruel way, that it really affected him. It really jarred him, and he decided that there needed to be action. Even if it wasn't going to dismantle Assad, even if it wasn't going to involve U.S. troops on the ground in Syria, there needed to be some sort of military response. So there's the suggestion there that there was some sort of moral revulsion or disgust at the actions of the Assad regime that made him rethink his prior position that this was not something that the United States was not going to be at the top of their foreign policy agenda. If we go back historically, we can talk about Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon is a really interesting and complex and multi-layered historical figure. And if you dig into Nixon's personal history, what you realize is that for much of his life, really all of his life, he suffered from this kind of imposter syndrome. And so, he loved football, but he was never the good football player, and he sat on the bench a lot. He was always kind of an outsider because he wasn't as wealthy as some of the other people in the circles in which he ran. He always felt that he had to struggle and suffer in ways that other political elites had not. And that really shaped and informed his political worldview. It made him a fighter. It made him tenacious. It made him work really hard to overcome that. But he was also overcome with this kind of imposter syndrome. He always felt, even when he had, he was vice president at a very young age, long stretch of never losing elections, and eventually became president of the United States. But he always felt as if he didn't really belong. And so that internal kind of uncertainty and vulnerability manifested itself in certain ways in terms of his domestic policy, in the rhetoric that he employed when he would talk about certain groups in society, and it eventually manifested itself in his foreign policy. So when he initially came into the office in '68 and was president, he was recognizing that the war in Vietnam was a big problem, and it was probably not a war that the United States was going to win. But he was not willing to kind of pull out of Vietnam immediately. And the reason that he was reluctant is that he was afraid that the United States would suffer in terms of its reputation. And really, in a lot of ways, and if you go back and listen to conversations, declassified documents, things like that, you see that it's not just the United States' reputation, but it's his personal reputation. And ultimately, that war would drag on for another 5 years, with many thousands of U.S. Military personnel being killed or wounded as a result. And it was very much this sense that if there was an immediate withdrawal of troops, then that would signal defeat. That would signal this kind of humiliating shrugging off of responsibility and a kind of minimization of the U.S. role in the world and Nixon's role, right? That he is weak or not capable of carrying out this war and winning successfully. So they talked about kind of leaving with respect, and he had this entire policy called Vietnamization. That was the idea that we would not try to win the war, but we would not withdraw immediately, and a lot of the emphasis would be on kind of turning over the war to the South Vietnamese, even knowing that it was a war that they couldn't win. There's a lot going on there psychologically, and it's not just rooted in kind of rational utility maximization. You have to get into the mindset and the psychological disposition of a leader to understand why they interpret the world the way that they do. Nixon is fascinating in that respect. LBJ is fascinating in that respect, really a tortured soul in that he inherited this war and didn't really see any way that he could win it, and it affected him personally. It's certainly the reason why he chose not to accept the Democratic Party's nomination, and he was only ran for office once as opposed to twice. So psychology plays a role, and it's not just rational decision making. There's a lot more that's going on there, and we know that because of cognitive science, right? We know that because of these tremendous advances in our understanding of how the human mind works, and then applying that to different settings. We can apply it to business, we could apply it to our daily lives, but you can also apply it to foreign policy making and international relations. So in terms of cognitive science as a field, what sorts of things is cognitive science interested in? Dresner, in his chapter, says that because of cognitive science, we know, quote, all individuals have fears, foibles, and failings that cause behavior to deviate from how a dispassionate decision maker would behave. First image theorists, so theorists that are trying to understand individual behavior, individual decision makers, leaders, they would look at these tendencies in human behavior and see whether they translate into recurrent patterns in world politics. So the idea is, if we know some very common or universal characteristics of the human mind and what elements are hardwired into the human brain, then we can understand how those things impact decision-making generally and perhaps foreign policy making. So that would really be the first question that cognitive science is asking. What are the elements of perception, understanding, and decision-making that are hardwired into the human brain? Then you have to go a step further and think about how those characteristics shape the way that we understand the world. So how does it impact our sensory perception, our intake of information, how we interpret that information, how we understand it, what we choose to believe, and what we have a hard time believing. All of those things are rooted in cognition. They're rooted in how our brain works. And then from that, we pull out what are the most relevant insights that we can apply to IR, and what sort of world do these attributes produce, right? If these things are universal to human perception, then how does that shape and condition the world in which we live? So we start from the level of the individual, but then we expand it all the way up to the globe, the world, the international system. But the starting point is individual cognition. So we're going to look at these. I'm just going to talk about the ones that Dresner talks about. There's all sorts of insights that we have learned from cognitive science. Some of them very interesting and very unexpected. It makes sense when it's presented to you, but it's not something that you consciously think about because it's so deeply embedded in you as a human. But we're going to talk about some of those prevailing cognitive attributes. The first that's mentioned is confirmation bias, right? We all are shaped and conditioned by what is called confirmation bias, meaning that human beings have a worldview. Part of that worldview is kind of hardwired into them. Part of it is a function of their experience in the world and the ways in which they have interacted with the world. And you're ultimately going to interpret reality through that worldview. So it's a mixture of your genetics, your experiences in the world, and the ways that you've been socialized and conditioned throughout your life. And that's going to be your worldview. So think of that for a second. All of us carrying around our worldview with us, none of it being inevitable, right? None of it being, kind of programmed into us like a computer. But nevertheless, it's something that's very meaningful and real and very hard to change. And confirmation bias essentially says that because we have this worldview, we have this set of past experiences, this set of attributes that shapes how we understand the world, we are going to interpret information differently based on the nature of that worldview. And particularly, we are going to resist or ignore information which doesn't correspond to it. So if you are, a left-wing liberal, Bernie Sanders supporter, and a conservative presents you with information showing that universal health care is expensive and problematic, and some of those functions could be better served by private markets, right? A very kind of mainstream conservative position on healthcare. Before you even start to interrogate the evidence, you are going to be primed to distrust it. And your brain is going to immediately set to work trying to destroy or discredit that information. And that's not even something that will be conscious on your part. You are immediately going to distrust that information. And then your brain is going to work very, very hard to make it so that you don't have to even engage with the information, right? You don't have to seriously consider it. You don't have to think about it as factual. That's an example from domestic politics, but it carries over to international politics as well, right? So if you grew up in the Cold War and you grew up in the United States and the Soviet Union was this great adversary and threat, then that is the lens through which you are going to view the world, right? You're going to view the world as this kind of us versus them mentality. You're going to be very skeptical of Russia, even after the Soviet Union dissolves and you no longer have, a communist state. You're going to be skeptical of that region of the world and former Soviet states. And you're also we talked about this a little bit last time, but you're going to try to take very, very different situations and make them fit the mold of the Cold War, right? So 9/11 happens and you try to fit something into the mold of this black and white, us versus them, simple, dichotomous understanding of the world. So that's a function of just how you've been socialized, how you've grown up. Now, some people, there's a tendency to look at this and say, oh, well, that's ignorance or that's lack of education. And you think of people, you present them with facts that conflict with their worldview, and they say, oh, well, that's a bunch of garbage. I don't believe that, right? That's not necessarily what we're talking about, right? Sometimes confirmation bias is rooted in just people not having information and not being willing to receive it. But what's interesting about this is it's not ignorance or lack of education. And in fact, those people who are the most educated and those people who have, the most kind of knowledge and experience in the world oftentimes have the most tenacious confirmation bias because they have more tools to resist conflicting information. So those of you that are, going off and getting a college education and having this kind of educational experience that others don't have, well, you're actually going to have a stronger sense of confirmation bias. You're going to be more able to resist information which does not correspond to your worldview. And your brain is going to be better at discounting information that doesn't fit with that worldview. So this is the idea of confirmation bias. We know that it exists, right? The science has proven that it exists over and over and over again. And we know that it shapes the way that we understand the world. Now, an example from international relations. I was listening to an interview recently with Anthony Bourdain, right? The travel writer, food critic, chef that had, a bunch of different shows and a bunch of very successful books, and then tragically committed suicide. And he was talking about going around the world and going to, places that most Americans don't go to, like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, and sitting down and having meals with people and having incredibly pleasant and rewarding experiences. And then he said, but you would see people's biases, right? You would see people's ways of understanding the world, and it was always disappointing. So he said numerous times, at the end of a really nice meal, when the conversation shifts to politics, he would encounter people that would be talking about how 9/11 was an inside job, and it was, the Jews in Israel that had done this. And he said it was always really disappointing. But from the point of view of this idea of confirmation bias, growing up in an environment in which you were subjected to the idea that the United States and Israel are cooperating to form some sort of global empire and dominate the Middle East, right? You can understand why someone would interpret the world through that lens and be very dismissive of the idea that, no, actually 9/11 was carried out by Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, and it wasn't an inside job, and Israel had nothing to do with it. And, Jews don't collaborate on a worldwide scale, right? That's just an anti-Semitic idea. So that's the idea of confirmation bias, and we can actually see it in Al-Qaeda's view of the United States, right? If you go back prior to 9/11, to the mid-1990s, we were asking ourselves in 2001, why do they hate us? And in 1996, Osama bin Laden had essentially put out a document that was his case against the United States. And it views the United States in a very singular way, right? The United States is an imperial power. It seeks to dominate the Middle East. It is a Christian nation that is at war with fundamental Muslim values, and it is occupying the Holy Lands and cooperating with, quote unquote, infidel secular leaders throughout the Middle East to control the region and to oppress and undermine those populations, right? That shows tremendous confirmation bias, right? Obviously, the United States has a ton of power in the Middle East, and Israel is a very important ally. But that's a particularly kind of dark and cynical picture of the United States and its role in the world. But you can understand it. You can understand that an individual who had grown up in a conflictual environment in which the United States seemed to be responsible for a lot of things that made their situation less secure would be prone to believe conspiracy theories, would be prone to have a very negative image of the United States, at least the United States foreign policy. So we see confirmation bias, and you see it in your everyday life as well. You see it in ways that people interpret and understand the world. So that's the first kind of cognitive mechanism that we can talk about. The second is something called fundamental attribution error, meaning that we will interpret actions differently based on who is doing them, right? And so in international relations, oftentimes we think of this as allies and adversaries. So when we're trying to interpret actions or we're trying to interpret statements, it's going to matter tremendously who is engaged in the action, who is making the statement. If an ally, like the UK or France or Australia or Canada, does something good, then we say, well, that's just the way that they behave, right? That's just how the British are. That's just how the Canadians are. That's just how the French are. It's in their nature. We expect it, right? We don't try to figure out why it happens. Whereas if an adversary does something good or something that we approve of, right? An adversary decides to back down from some aggressive course of action, or an adversary praises your country, which was not necessarily something that you expected, then we say, oh well, they're in a tricky situation. They were compelled to do this. They had to do this. Or we'll distrust it, right? We'll say, well, that's what they're saying publicly, but is there some sort of ulterior motive here, right? So if an adversary is doing something that you approve of, it's not in their nature. It's something that they were compelled to do. Similarly, if an ally does something that we dislike, then we are going to look, our brain is going to set out and try and find ways that this was beyond their control. This was not a conscious action. This was something that they were forced into doing, right? And it was beyond their control. So the idea here is that we don't just kind of interpret events and statements on the basis of their merits. The source is important, and so it ties back into prior experience. It ties back into how we're socialized and our expectations when we look out at the world, right? A good example here is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So this happened in late 1979. The Soviets sent in tens of thousands of Soviet troops into Afghanistan. They were trying to prop up a kind of Soviet-friendly regime that was there, that was facing some trouble. But they were also trying to ensure that this border that they shared with Afghanistan didn't become a conflict zone, right? We didn't have civil war in Afghanistan, and then all of a sudden they have refugees flooding into their country or something like that. So what this ended up being was a 10-year war, right? The 10-year Soviet-Afghan war, in which the Soviets got dragged into a situation very much like our experience in Vietnam. It was a foreign policy quagmire that they really didn't know how to extract themselves from. And in the end, this is probably one of the key factors that contributed to the end of the Soviet Union. You had this costly, protracted conflict that they just couldn't resolve. And the United States was exploiting it, right? So if you've seen the movie Charlie Wilson's War, right, this is basically what the war is about, is this effort to draw the Soviets into a trap and then fund the Afghan mujahideen that ended up becoming, at least some of them, Osama bin Laden included, ended up becoming Al-Qaeda, right, when the conflict finally ended. But drawing them into this conflict, arming the locals, and then using it to kind of bleed the Soviets. But at the time, right, the Soviets, thinking about how their action would be perceived, they didn't think this would be as controversial as it ended up being, right? The Soviets thought this is about sovereignty. This is, a country that's right on the brink of collapse, right on our border, and we're trying to ensure that it doesn't go over the edge into the abyss, and then we have this conflict raging right on our border. That's because they were thinking about how they perceive themselves in the world, right? It was the Soviet self-image that they were thinking about. From the point of view of the United States, this was interpreted as Soviet aggression. This was interpreted as the Soviets, going in, doing what they always do, being expansionist, being aggressive, trying to export and expand their model of communism into another country and backing it up with violence and force, right? Ultimately, this led to a 10-year conflict, which probably was one of the key factors in bringing down the Soviet Union. And it also had real impacts, just in terms of like posturing. So, for instance, the United States did not participate in the 1980 Olympics in Moscow, and that was in protest over the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan the year before, right at the end of 1979. And there was all sorts of kind of diplomatic maneuvering and wrangling over this Soviet invasion and international condemnation of it. So there again, we come back to this idea of attribution error, in which the United States and its allies are understanding the actions of the Soviets in a very different way than the Soviets are understanding their own actions, and what that leads to in international relations. Lastly, prospect theory. Now, prospect theory is interesting. Prospect theory comes out of economics, and once we explain it a little bit, you'll understand why. This was a theory of behavioral economics that emerged in the 1970s and subsequently has been applied in all sorts of different settings, right? You can apply prospect theory to lots of different areas of the human experience. When I think of prospect theory, I always think of gamblers. And I don't know if you've ever been gambling, if you've been at a card game or you've been at a casino and you're down, you've lost money. You start to behave in ways, even if you're, haven't had a drop to drink, like you're completely sober, you start to behave in ways that are reckless. You almost feel as if you're drunk. And prospect theory actually explains that, right? That basically it's saying that our tolerance for risk, the types of actions that we engage in relative to risk, are dependent on your perception of a current situation. So when things are going well, we are likely to be risk averse. So if you're at the casino and you're up a couple $100 and you're having a good night, you're much more likely to be conservative. You're much more likely to call it an early night, to quit while you're ahead, things like that, to stay the course on a current action as opposed to doing something really risky. When things are going badly, you are much, much more likely to pursue risky strategies, and there might be a very, very small chance that it works out well for you, but your whole calculus of risk and reward and the type of risk that you're willing to take on changes, and you start to behave in really different ways. And we've all seen that. We've all seen individuals do that in their lives, take some pretty ridiculous risks in a moment in which they're kind of down on their luck. And we see it in gambling for sure. We also see it in foreign policy and international relations, right? So if a country is doing well, in whatever way that might be, it's doing well in terms of trade and its economic situation, it's doing well in terms of carrying out some, conflict, fighting a war, they're going to be risk averse. They're going to want to stay the course or, only marginally change the types of things that they're doing in the world. Whereas if things are going badly, they're going to start to engage in really risky kind of last-ditch Hail Mary type behavior. And a lot of times it doesn't work out, right? Just in terms of probability, it's unlikely that it'll work out. This can be applied in all sorts of different settings. A lot of them related to security. If we're looking at the course of a war and the war kind of turns for one side, and you start to look at the country or countries that are losing, what types of things do they do in terms of strategy, and how it changes as the tides turn, as the fortunes change. But we can also understand it just generally in terms of foreign policy. So for instance, one of the explanations for Putin's recent behavior, really over the last 10 years or so, Putin has become much more aggressive, much more confrontational, much more critical of Western countries like, the United States and the United Kingdom, and has started to engage in actions that, really go against international law, right? They call into question things like sovereignty and non-intervention, and they just kind of happened, right? There hasn't been a military response. Nobody's been willing to go to war with Russia over these things, but they've led to incredibly harsh economic sanctions. They've led to the kind of tarnishing of Russia's international reputation, and in particular Putin's reputation, right? Putin, for the most part, the world over, is just viewed as an aggressive authoritarian dictator at this point, where there actually was a period in which, individuals thought he was carving some sort of new path, right? Some new sort of managed democracy, authoritarian democracy. But now it's pretty much understood that Putin is a violent thug. And a lot of people understand that through the lens of prospect theory, right? You think of the larger situation of Russia, its recent history, the decline of the Soviet Union, in which the USSR was a global superpower. Even after the Soviet Union fell, there was this tremendously turbulent period in the 1990s, but eventually, largely through oil, the country was able to recover, and it had this period of energy dominance. But now Putin's looking out on the horizon. He's realizing that fossil fuels, there will be a shift, right, away from fossil fuels. And so oil-rich nations can only count on that source of wealth for so much longer. And so from the point of view of prospect theory, they would say that Putin is looking out at a horizon that doesn't look particularly rosy, and is thinking about this kind of fall from grace, this period in which the Soviet Union was an incredibly powerful country, and he was an incredibly powerful and respected leader, and now that's changed. And that's leading to a more aggressive, more risky, more really rash and kind of unstable set of behaviors, set of actions. So from that point of view, this is not a situation in which Russia is on top. They're not pursuing the status quo. They're not being risk averse. They're at the bottom of a valley, and they have fallen from grace. And they're willing to engage in riskier actions with the hope that it will restore their position in the world somewhat, right? And so they've done things like invade Crimea, or intervene in American elections, or say much more confrontational things on the international stage, be less willing to work with allies, less willing to cooperate or consider the legitimacy of Western institutions like NATO and the European Union, et cetera, right? So prospect theory is interesting to think about just in terms of your own behavior and your own actions, because I think we all see it a little bit in ourselves. But once you get up to the level of foreign policy, and particularly looking at things historically, it can be really interesting to employ prospect theory to think about why states and why leaders do the things that they do. Lastly, so the results of this, what this produces. Those that study cognition and cognitive science say that when you apply this to international politics, these different characteristics create a world that is likely to be violent. And the status quo that we have, so the kind of standard normal situation that we will confront in international politics most of the time, is going to be hawkish. Countries are going to be war prone, they're going to be confrontational, they're going to be aggressive, they're going to be distrustful of others' intentions. But what's interesting is that although this kind of sounds like the realist worldview, like that cynical realist worldview, they get at it from a different perspective. Like realists start at the characteristics of the international system, and they say this is the system that these are the qualities that this system produces. Whereas those that use cognitive science start at the level of individual human psychology and say this is the outcome, right? The system is an outcome from what is happening at the individual level, as opposed to vice versa. So this is a function of human cognition as opposed to some systemic level inevitability, right? Because the world is anarchic and self-help and there's no overarching power to tell us what to do, it's going to be nasty, like the realists would say. But no, the cognitive folks say something different, operating with a different direction. So it's kind of interesting to think about. And cognitive science is fascinating. It's a frontier in our knowledge. There's still a bunch of stuff we don't understand about the human brain. But as we understand more, the ways in which we can apply it, not only to international relations, but just everything, business, social relations, politics, the economy, is really interesting. So we'll wrap up there. That, as I said, is kind of our last substantive lecture. The final lecture you have in this class is really talking about how to transition from thinking about these tools in an academic context to using them to understand the world and really applying this information that you've gained in the class So just a little bit to read from Dresner and then Sterling Foker's chapter 11. And as I said, the questions here are, how can you use the conceptual tools that you've gained in this class to better understand the world around you? And we'll come back to this question of why does this matter, right? We started there at the beginning of the class, but we'll come back to that question. So my hope is that you leave this class with some tools that you can take forward, right? You might not remember specific names of theories and things like that in 5 years, but what I hope is that you'll emerge from this class a better, more informed, more capable interpreter of what's happening in international relations and global politics. And so I'll just talk about that a little bit and why that matters. So we'll wrap up there next time. Thanks very much.